Another thing that people have taken as a given that seems to be, that could possibly be a complete fabrication. It might be another offshoot of this Mason's plan to just siphon off a bunch of money from the space program, but also siphon a bunch of money from the nuclear weapons program, because it seems like, and this was only brought to my attention through you and your post about it and the footage that you've shown, it seems like at least the test footage that we've seen of a lot of nuclear weapons from back in the day when they're telling our parents to duck and cover under their school desk to protect them from a nuclear blast, and you got the air raid sirens going off. Obviously, our entire culture was completely paralyzed by the idea of nuclear weapons. But when you're looking at the test footage, given back then it might not have looked fake. You know, back then they actually thought King Kong looked real in the movie, or Jaws looked real in the movie, but now we can see it's clearly fake. When you look back at that footage, it's oftentimes, it looks like the scale of, say, a subdivision where you're in an empty lot across the street aiming a camera at a farmhouse on the other side of the street, a lot over, and then the blast hits and the farmhouse just gets destroyed. The house just gets ripped apart. But what happened to the camera? You know, who's filming that? The camera is only a couple 100 feet away from that. And in some videos, man, this is the most compelling, is the blast comes from behind the camera. What the hell is that? The blast comes from behind the camera and the house gets blown away out into the background of the shot. And you're like, what kind of camera in that day and age could survive that blast, but an entire building can't? I mean, it seems way out there. You've changed my mind on a little of this. You dipped my needle further into the fringe for sure.
Yeah. So it's just another way to get us scared into giving them more money. So we're giving them hundreds of billions of dollars in this space race that America and Russia were doing, and they also did the Cold War. So they scared us into this nuclear scare, and then stole a bunch more money to build fake nuclear weapons. And so, yeah, the nuclear weapons don't exist as such. The tests that you've seen, the very early ones, like you were talking about, are clearly fake, just done on models. Some of the later tests were done using stacked dynamite. You just get a shitload of dynamite and blow it all up, and it makes the mushroom cloud, does the whole thing. And what they'd do is they'd tell one team that, you know, they'd have a bunch of people 20 miles away, say, army guys watching, doing the test. And then you've got over on one island these people stacking dynamite, saying that we're doing this for comparative purposes, and the real nuke's going to be over on that island. Meanwhile, they got another team over on that island stacking dynamite for comparative purposes, and the real nuke's going to be on the other island. So they even have military men stacking dynamite that they know is being used for these supposed nuclear explosions, but they believe that they've seen a real nuke, even though they tell them to cover your eyes and put your head in your laps as it happens. They don't see anything until the smoke clears afterwards. But yeah, a lot of military men will swear, you know, up and down that nukes must exist because they were there at some of those tests, and it's just dynamite. They do it beneath water by stacking dynamite in submarines, and you can do it up in the air as well. The Hiroshima and Nagasaki nukes, you can see that they're clearly two superimposed explosions, one on top of each other. There's two smoke plumes made to look like they're one. I actually used this technique several times. If you look at this nuke footage, there's if you go to my website, Nuclear Weapons Do Not Exist, you'll see these 3 documentaries that expose the thing completely. And so not only do so for instance, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, what happened is that they were firebombed. So the cities were leveled just like Tokyo was firebombed, and the damage is comparable. But they claim that it all happened from one blast. But this is clearly not true, because flowers and plants started growing within a month, and they say nuclear radiation would exist for hundreds, thousands of years and would cause birth defects and everything. But nowadays, Hiroshima's a bustling city. Everyone's living there. Everything's growing there. Radiation's not a problem. There is some radiation after any explosion, so you would be able to go there with a Geiger counter and get some radiation, especially right afterwards, but it dies down quite quickly. And nuclear power, one of the most prominent nuclear physicists in America, he's dead now, Galen Winsor. He was involved in setting up most of the nuclear power plants in America. And he went all over America for years giving this lecture about how nuclear power is just the most expensive and effective way to boil water, and they're essentially steam plants, and that's all it is. The nuclear component that supposedly causes all this radioactive waste that needs to be, hazmat dealt with, and they drill holes into bedrock and put the nuclear waste deep under the earth, and they've got all these crazy regulations. He says, when we were first working with nuclear material, uranium, plutonium, we held it in our hands, and if some of it got hot, we'd throw it in the water, and that was it. No problem. He said, I would bathe, I would swim in the pool there that we would throw the radiated metals into, no problem. People thought he was crazy. He started drinking a glass of water from it every day, no problems. And then in his lecture, he started eating radioactive waste. So you can see on YouTube, type in Galen Winsor, and he'll take out a Geiger counter, show you some radioactive material. He'll take it out of a tube, and they'll say, I've just caused an EPA, if the EPA was in here, we'd have to clear out this whole area for half a mile, and people would have to come in with hazmat suits, blah, blah, and then he puts it back in the tube, and there's some left over on his hand. So then he licks his hand, shows the waste on his tongue, swallows it, and says, I've been doing this for years. And so the idea is just another fear campaign. And that's why they get the military involved in all these nuclear power plants and the nuclear weapons. It's to siphon off money, keep us afraid, and keep us playing off one another. Everybody thinks that, Russia and America are enemies, and that the Cold War is real and the space race is real. But it's all just, they're all like WWE. It's like Hulk Hogan and Macho Man. They're all paid by Vince McMahon. They all go out to eat together. If you're high up in politics anywhere, for sure you're part of this brotherhood that controls everything. There's no independent man at the head of any state, and if he was, what's he doing? The only type of government that should exist is a government that doesn't tax or perform violence on its people. So the only kind of candidate I would vote for is someone who's for the abolition of all taxes and legislation other than common law. If you hurt or harm a person or their property, theft or breach of contract, those three things, those common laws, are the only things anyone should ever have to go to court for. Everything else is a victimless crime, and this is the big system that they get us caught up in. So they've got millions of statutes and acts that supposedly ignorance of the law is no excuse. So if you break any of these millions of legislations, they've got reasons to fine you or kidnap you and put you in jail, or even murder you if you don't pay them up. So I don't vote. I don't recommend voting. If you could get out of paying taxes, I'd recommend that too.
Wow. Well, man, this has been super fascinating. Doing a show like this once a week, sometimes it gets pretty hard to rattle me, pretty hard to get me excited for a topic, but this has done it.
Do nuclear bombs exist? Your immediate answer is yes. But how do you know? During the mid-20th century, television and movie watchers were bombarded with imagery of what was purported to be atomic test footage. But what were they really watching? They couldn't rewind a videotape or rescan through a video on their computer. So what option did they have but to accept these images at their face value? Now we have opportunity to scrutinize these images to see if they hold up to analysis. Take a look at these trees. Now what was that? And who turned the camera? They're in awfully straight lines, aren't they? Now this must be a different blast because it's coming from a different direction. Wait, now they've put it back. But those are the same trees we saw in the first clip, aren't they? And now this. First they showed us these trees that they panned left on. Then they show us these trees that look like they should be next to a model train. Notice how straight the rows are. It looks artificial to me. Then they show us these trees again. Where's the forward camera? And then back to these trees again. And then they show us what looks to be a real forest that's been chopped down or torn down. Now take a look at this. It's footage of the first H-bomb test called Ivy Mike. Watch how it changes. That's a composite. Then it morphs into this. It looks like a completely separate explosion. Now take a look at the frame before the explosion and then the one after. These frames were cut together. Why? Then this frame was cut to this, which looks like the sun to me. It looks like they're zooming in on the sun. Maybe a composite because the clouds aren't moving. Then they introduced some sort of liquid. It looks like a laboratory concoction in composite with the sun. Next is Operation Dominic Fireballs in the Yukon. What does that look like to you? Watch it again. It's the sun. Now here's Operation Greenhouse. These guys are getting all ready to see what looks to be the sun again. The sun seems to start to expand. Maybe it's being zoomed in on. They worship the sun after all, Lucifer. So why wouldn't they use him as their greatest weapon? And who headed up the whole program? None other than J. Robert Oppenheimer of the Oppenheimer family, who is reputed to have been the original financiers who got the Rothschilds started in Frankfurt, Germany in the 18th century.
He should do his duty, and to impress him, takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds."
You're thinking, what about Hiroshima? Is that Hiroshima? Is that Hiroshima? That looks like Hiroshima, but it looks like it's been carpet bombed. Check out this image of Rotterdam. Was that a nuclear bomb? Now compare it to this image of Hiroshima. Actually, this isn't Hiroshima, it's Tokyo after firebombing in 1945. If you accept that FDR might have had foreknowledge of the bombing at Pearl Harbor, maybe you might want to leave room for the possibility that his propaganda machine might have created the myth of atomic bombs. There's no question that the powers that be have ballistics with tremendous explosive capacity. But this shot, for example, could easily be high-volume dynamite. And what are we looking at here? Take a look at this house again. Whatever was strong enough to blow it to smithereens wasn't strong enough to even shake the camera. And look how high up the camera position is. Are we looking at another model? Now look at this bus and this car. Whatever's blowing them up is not moving the camera. And this building seems to blow up from the inside. Everything gets blown every which way except for the camera. Except look in this shot, it seems to tilt up a little bit. Now this is one of my favorites. Watch the two guys behind the glass. Who's filming them? Isn't he being exposed to all that rocket fuel? Anyways, I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. If you're hell-bent on believing that they can blow up the world at the push of a button, then go ahead. But next time you hear a politician justifying the invasion of a country based on the fact that they supposedly have weapons of mass destruction, realize that they're not only lying about the other country supposedly possessing weapons of mass destruction, they also may be lying about the very existence of weapons of mass destruction.
Do North Korea have nukes? Are the Iranians still trying to build a nuclear bomb? Are we perpetually on the brink of thermonuclear war? The governments and the elites that control them have such a history of lying to the public, can we not assume we are not being told the truth? From the Titanic to 9/11, the public have been fed one pantomime after another. Can we not be forgiven for questioning nuclear weapons, perhaps their tallest of tales? All this time has passed and still no nuclear war. This is excused with the notion of mutually assured destruction, the idea that all supposedly nuclear-armed nations fear their own nuclear destruction too much to try to destroy another, and so we live in perpetual nuclear peace in a world of continuous conventional war. What if all war was a fraud, the banking elite controlling all sides, all playing for a draw, not trying to defeat their enemy, but controlling their populations with fear? Why not forget the weapons and simulate it all on computers?
It's a bluff, John. Call it off. No, it's not a bluff. It's real.
Hello, General Barringer. Stephen Falcon.
Mr. Falcon, you picked a hell of a day for a visit.
General, what you see on these screens up here is a fantasy, a computer-enhanced hallucination. Those blips are not real missiles, they're phantoms.
Jack, there's nothing to indicate a simulation at all. Everything's working perfectly.
But does it make any sense?
Does what make any sense?
Wouldn't it be cheaper and easier to pretend? Why spend all that money on weapons you know you are never going to use? When convincing your enemy or your public you've got them achieves the same ends. Would the elites want to endanger themselves with nuclear weapons, considering what they can supposedly do? Do they want to destroy the world and hide underground in bunkers? Or is that just what they want you to think? They haven't done it yet, and I wouldn't hold your breath. Why have lots of nukes pointed at each other? Why not just have one very big one each, powerful enough to destroy the world? Would it not offer the same protection? If nuclear weapons exist, why do they tell us? Why aren't they kept secret? Surely it would be the best way to prevent them from proliferating. They are so secretive about all their other weapon systems, like HARP, directed energy weapons, railguns and coil guns and rods of God or kinetic weapons. Real or not, nuclear weapons are weapons of propaganda, designed to fill the public with fear, through which the elites control the population of the world.
Is this a game, or is it real?
What's the difference?
Oh, wow.
German scientists had split the atom by bombarding uranium with neutrons, which caused instability in the uranium nucleus. During this split, mass was lost and was converted into kinetic energy. They had discovered fission, and with it opened a Pandora's box.
If each of those neutrons goes into another uranium nucleus and causes fission, then the first fission has led to more than 2 fissions in the next generation, and you can see that each successive generation has many more neutrons, and this causes an explosive chain reaction.
If 2 masses of highly fissionable uranium in the form of a sphere and a plug could be brought together with sufficient speed inside a bomb, an exponentially increasing chain reaction with explosive force would result.
It was known that the nucleus of one form of uranium, isotope 235, would split when it absorbed a neutron. When this happened, energy was released and more neutrons were created that struck and split other nuclei. When it happens continuously, it's known as a chain reaction. No one knew at the start how much fissionable material was needed to support an explosive chain reaction. That volume would be known as the critical mass. Another element, only discovered in late 1941 by Berkeley nuclear chemist Glenn Seaborg, also had the properties to explode in a chain reaction.
And we immediately saw no one's mind was on anything but how can this be used for war? It gradually became clear. It's quite possible to make an explosion from this.
It was this concern that led refugee German physicist Leo Szilard to reveal that possibility to the U.S. government. Together with Albert Einstein and Edward Teller, he composed a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt. It told of a terrible possibility. Germany had the talent and the knowledge to research and develop an atomic weapon. Delivering the letter to Roosevelt on their behalf was economist Alexander Sachs, a friend of Szilard and economic advisor to the president.
Let's take a look at this letter. It may become possible to set up a nuclear chain reaction in a large mass of uranium. This new phenomenon would also lead to the construction of bombs, and it is conceivable, though much less certain, that extremely powerful bombs of a new type may thus be constructed. However, such bombs might very well prove to be too heavy for transportation by air.
Major General Leslie R. Groves, the man responsible for the Pentagon, was placed in charge of the project.
The project was massive, to design and build a device that existed only in theory from material that didn't exist in any quantity under unprecedented secrecy.
Fermi tackled the first obstacle to the bomb, the question of whether or not a sustained chain reaction could be induced in a uranium reactor. Without the successively doubling power of the chain reaction, a bomb would be an impossibility.
Fermi was one of the few scientists who was talented both in theory and in practice. He loved getting his hands dirty. Leo Szilard was the antithesis of Enrico Fermi. Szilard usually slept late. He soaked in the bathtub to get fresh ideas.
While in the bathtub, Szilard remained focused on the competition, the German bomb effort. He convinced scientists in the U.S., whose community thrived on openness, to censor their own papers so that they would not inadvertently help the Germans.
This would also facilitate the hoax. The nuclear bomb hoax thrives on secrecy, and in fact, one of its main purposes is to create an apparent need for extreme secrecy within the government and the industrial military complex. One of the main purposes for the creation of the myth of nuclear weapons is the rise of the secret services. Nuclear weapons provide a perfect excuse for governments to keep secrets and tell lies to their populations. As a result of the nuclear weapon myth, the population demand it. Without nuclear weapons, there is little or no justification for keeping secrets and telling lies to the population, or for the organizations charged with that task.
But sometimes we forget that security violations can be dangerous business too. If classified information about this test mission fell into enemy hands, the consequences could be disastrous to all of us, individually and collectively as a nation. Security is only common sense. Don't take chances. Avoid loose talk. Safeguard classified information. Report security violations at once. Prompt action may prevent a minor incident from developing into a serious one. Avoid writing about classified material in letters home. Be sure you're secure. Don't be careless.
I hate a careless man.
As the U.S. bomb effort was taking its first tentative steps, news that the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin had begun actively pursuing uranium research rippled through the American scientific community. It would take nothing short of a disaster to move the president to take decisive action, and a disaster was not far off.
Pearl Harbor plunged the United States into war. The first self-sustaining chain-reacting pile was successfully operated by Enrico Fermi. Fermi's success brought intense efforts between government and the private sector, creating huge industries for uranium separation in the town of Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and for the production of plutonium in Hanford, Washington.
They were trying to demonstrate that the fission process could be harnessed by launching a sustained chain reaction in uranium. They built the first primitive reactor in a squash court beneath the stands of the university's football stadium. The reactor consisted of a pile in which a fission reaction could be initiated and controlled.
They did it by piling layers of graphite and then embedding balls of uranium, so that when the neutrons started flying through, they would be slowed by the graphite, collide with the uranium, release more neutrons, and those neutrons would continue in the chain reaction pattern.
This momentous achievement, only detectable by a Geiger counter, meant that the fission process could be sustained. Nuclear energy could be released in a controlled way, as in a reactor, or perhaps cataclysmically, as in a bomb.
This in no way indicates that an explosive chain reaction is achievable.
To head up the installation, Groves, an expert judge of men, chose a most unlikely candidate, J. Robert Oppenheimer. A gifted physics professor, Oppenheimer had a reputation for being temperamental, perhaps not suited to a highly stressful assignment.
It was advised that Oppenheimer would be a disaster. People told him that Oppenheimer couldn't run a hot dog stand.
Oppenheimer was a fascinating and complicated man. Fundamentally, he seems to have had some of the qualities of an actor. He was different things to different people.
Oppenheimer drew luminaries like Enrico Fermi, Hans Bethe, and Edward Teller to the facility, as well as technicians fresh out of college. During the fall of 1942, the theoretical physicists at Los Alamos began the difficult process of trying to determine how much U-235 it would take to make a bomb.
And the scientists tell him, well, it could be X amount, but that's plus or minus by a factor of 10. Groves is absolutely staggered. He uses the illustration that, well, you're giving a wedding, and you say it's for 100 people, but maybe 1,000 will turn up, or maybe 10. So how can you make any sort of plans?
Robert Oppenheimer's team of physicists doubled the amount of uranium-235 thought necessary to achieve critical mass and sustain an explosive chain reaction to 200 kilograms. Their calculation, made without adequate samples of U-235 for tests, would prove to be 10 times the required amount.
It was important that the critical mass was not too small. That would make nuclear bombs too cheap and easy to make. But equally, it was important that the critical mass was not too large, as this would make deliverable bombs an impossibility.
The main obstacle was how to quickly assemble two smaller subcritical masses into one larger explosive one. The bomb design that they came up with was a gun design. Inside the bomb, a cannon would fire one piece of radioactive fuel into another at 3,000 feet per second. The pieces would have to come together fast enough to prevent spontaneously emitted neutrons from melting the fuel, causing the bomb to fizzle rather than explode.
But the engineering aspects were daunting. It's one thing to say you can shoot a piece of uranium at a second piece, but how do you do it? How fast does it have to go? How do you stop it at the end? How do you keep it together long enough as a mass so that it does go high order and give you an atomic bomb?
The scientists at Los Alamos also studied tampers. barrier materials that would slow the expansion of the critical mass and reflect neutrons back to feed the fission process inside the bomb. On December 28, 1942, President Roosevelt approved an additional $500 million investment in the Manhattan Project. The first priority, to build the massive industrial facilities that would produce the fissionable material to fuel the atom bomb.
Though they wanted people to believe a nuclear explosion was possible, it was also important that not just anyone could do it, that it was not replicable without extreme cost, and so they would make the nuclear fuel as difficult to make as possible. There is also a huge profit motive for doing this. There are vast sums of money to be made from supposed nuclear fuel, from its production and from its protection, transportation and storage before and after use.
These gigantic structures contained multiple calutrons, box-shaped collection units that were configured in a racetrack layout. A magnetic field passed throughout the entire oval of calutrons, causing the divergence of streams of U-235 and U-238, so that the separated isotopes could be collected. A single calutron could capture a mere 10 grams of U-235 daily. A staggering total of 1,152 would be built by war's end. Because of the intense time constraints, Groves could not afford to build pilot plants, facilities to test the scaling up of the laboratory processes.
They're physically building Oak Ridge and Y-12, the electromagnetic separation plant, before the design drawings had even been approved. And it's incredible that you would never do this.
Groves was not content to rely on just two approaches, Y-12 and Hanford, to produce the weapons-grade fuel for the bomb. By September 1943, he had begun construction on a third, K-25, a gigantic gaseous diffusion plant at Oak Ridge. In the diffusion process, a gaseous compound, uranium hexafluoride, passes through a cascade of barriers, each one giving a slight enrichment of the lighter isotope U-235. The difficulty lay in finding a barrier that would not be degraded by the very corrosive gas. Scientists and engineers were not able to manufacture a satisfactory barrier until a year after site construction began on K-25. A building that would ultimately cover more area than any structure ever built. The U-shape measured half a mile long by 1,000 feet wide. With an area of 2 million square feet, it contained a series of sealed containers and cascades that ran the length of the building.
If anybody asks you what you make in Oak Ridge, you tell them you're making the lights for the lightning bugs, or that you're making the holes for the donuts.
Huge industrial facilities were commissioned and built without any significant evidence a deliverable bomb was possible. There always was doubt that nuclear fuel could be produced in sufficient quantities whilst maintaining a pure product.
Fission is more readily produced in a rare uranium isotope, uranium-235, that occurs naturally at a ratio of 1 to 139 to its less useful twin, uranium-238. Chemically identical, the isotopes were almost impossible to separate. The only workable method in 1942 was electromagnetic separation. In this process, a mass spectrometer used for separating electrically charged particles according to their mass sent a stream of uranium atoms past a magnet. Atoms of the lighter isotope U-235 would be deflected more than those of the heavier U-238 and would be captured one atom at a time. Scientists at Columbia University championed a competing mode of separation, gaseous diffusion. This method passed the isotope through a porous barrier that separated the lighter isotope from its heavier counterpart, but it proved to be technically challenging.
In a square centimeter, about the size of a thumbnail, you've got to have hundreds of millions of pores, and they have to all be the same size. If they're too big, the gas flows through without any separation. If they're too small, the gas gets in there and condenses on the surface, won't go through. So you talk about obstacles.
But if a suitable barrier could be manufactured, It promised a greater yield than the electromagnetic process. Both techniques would have to be done on a massive scale.
This could well all be an entirely fraudulent exercise that takes uranium and turns it into expensive uranium. This can be done simply by changing the label.
A new man-made element, plutonium, was gaining favor as a possible fuel. Identified in 1941, plutonium was almost twice as likely to undergo fission as uranium-235 and could be produced on a large scale by irradiating uranium in nuclear reactors. In order to produce plutonium, 3 production reactors were designed by engineers at the University of Chicago that would be built in Hanford, Washington. Groves initiated the construction at Hanford on August 27, 1943.
Though plutonium may exist in theory, it is likely that it can only be produced in trace quantities and not in sufficient quantity or purity to establish what its attributes are, nor in that which would be required for a bomb. The qualities of plutonium are highly convenient. Not only is it highly fissionable, but also castable and machinable. These qualities were improved by alloying plutonium with gallium, though other elements were tried. Gallium also supposedly lowers the susceptibility of plutonium to corrosion.
The isotope we produced was plutonium-238, produced by the deuteron bombardment of uranium. Then a month later, joined by Emilio Segre, we identified in this room the isotope of importance, plutonium-239, and isolated it so that it could be have its fission properties measured at the 37-inch cyclotron.
But Hanford depended as much on chemical separation as it did on the reactors. The chemistry was Glenn Seaborg's, massively scaled up from his University of Chicago team's ultra-microchemical work.
We had been working with what you call tracer amounts, invisible amounts, detected by its radioactivity. But we couldn't deduce the chemical properties with certainty that way. We needed to work with actual ponderable, weighable amounts. And that's why we produced weighable amounts of plutonium in this way. This meant that we had to work, I say we, are the chemists working with me, on what they call an ultra-microchemical scale.
It was looking less and less likely that enough U-235 could be produced to impact the war. At the same time, the alternative, plutonium, was proving to be equally tricky. Impurities in this new element were leading to increased neutron activity that would cause bombs to pre-detonate, to fizzle before the two halves joined in a critical mass.
There are production problems at Oak Ridge. They're not sure they can even make any uranium at that point, uranium-235. And so if they can't use plutonium in a gun, there may in fact not even be an atomic bomb.
It's a real crisis. It's at that point that I think Oppenheimer's talent comes to the fore, where he brings in the people, new people in fact, and he reorganizes Los Alamos.
Scientists and dignitaries awaited the detonation of the first atomic bomb in a desolate area of the New Mexico desert, known aptly as Jornada del Muerto, or Journey of Death. They had taken bets on how much power their creation might unleash, but many wondered whether the weapon would work at all.
But as the test date drew closer, there was a nagging uncertainty about whether the bomb would actually work at all. In a meeting before the test, Hans Bethe described all that was known about the bomb, and what wasn't.
Litchfield and I overruled Fermi, and that is a very dangerous thing to do, because Fermi was almost always right, but we overruled him. And so I felt uncertain for that reason.
What was thought of during the war was, and very often we kept saying, maybe we'll come across some insuperable physical obstacle which prevents it from working. You can easily imagine those things. For example, a little delay in the emission of fast neutrons after fission.
Norman Ramsey bet low.
And I bet 0. And I think that was the most intelligent bet of any, because 0 included not only 0, but it also included the first 25 generations of neutrons. I mean, this is an exponentially growing thing, so it's probably first 35 generations of neutrons. If it stopped anywhere along there, it would be 0 in the scale that they had. So I had the biggest number of, statistically, the best chance of winning.
Very hard to sleep, very hard to get your minds off all the things that might have gone wrong, very hard not to think about the implications. But, you know, we were consumed with the job, especially this crucial one, a test fire to see if this whole idea would work. And that was in everyone's mind, I think.
Everybody was extremely excited to see if it actually would turn out to be that way, because no one really knew whether the thing would work or not.
It was determined that explosive means would do the job by taking a subcritical mass and making it critical, so the radioactive material would detonate. 2 methods to do that had been devised. One was a gun method, where 2 halves of subcritical material were shot together to form the critical mass, starting the nuclear detonation. It was discovered the gun method would work with uranium, but not with plutonium. The gun method was the easiest, but the science of implosion would have to be developed also. It required science and engineering that would enable simultaneous and uniform compression of plutonium. Because nothing like this had ever been created, the plutonium weapon would also have to be tested.
The plutonium bomb's new configuration called for an outer shell of explosives that would direct symmetrical shockwaves inward, compressing a subcritical central mass of plutonium. The resulting increase in the density would shrink distances between nuclei, thus starting the explosive chain reaction.
Nobody had ever taken high explosives, wrapped them around something, and got a symmetrical explosion. And so they weren't even sure they could do that technically. It was a very, very tough engineering problem.
Lenses were created, explosive lenses that would focus the shock wave inward to compress the subcritical mass to critical. High explosives were mixed to form the cocoon the fissionable material would rest in. The molds for the lenses were the biggest problems. The molten explosive had to be cooled just right to prevent air bubbles, which would interfere with the detonation. The lenses required precision casting with machine finishing. Tolerances for the 100 or so pieces had to fit together within a few thousandths of an inch.
Inside the very center of the bomb was an initiator, surrounded by a sphere of plutonium. This sphere was encased within a set of symmetrically located, high-explosive lenses, creating an implosion which forced the plutonium into itself, attaining critical mass.
But what if the real test was unsuccessful? The fissionable material might be lost from the detonation of the high explosive surrounding it. The decision was made early on to contain any misfire inside a huge steel vessel. It was 25 feet long, 12 feet in diameter, 14 inches thick, and weighed 214 tons. It was called Jumbo. By the time it was delivered, though, production of the fissionable material had increased, and there was greater confidence in the success of the bomb. Use of Jumbo was canceled. Instead, it was hung from a tower 800 yards from ground zero.
They cancelled the use of Jumbo because at this point they had decided to fake it, and use of Jumbo would make the bomb be perceived as undeliverable.
Before assembly began, a receipt was signed for the plutonium, value at least several $100 million. At the moment the receipt was signed, the test shifted to military control.
Took that plutonium and in turn gave a shiny bomb casing full of used pinball machine parts.
They didn't allow many people, but they did allow me, and I looked with, I closed, had one eye protected. I couldn't look with both eyes, and so I was looking with just one eye.
All the scientists were 20 miles away, but most feared a dud, especially since a blank test of the explosives surrounding the core had failed just days before. Sensors showed that they had not fired simultaneously and would not have compressed the core properly.
It was really unnerving when the blank shot failed. The normal anxiety that one might have had with a device on which you had worked but had never been tested fully was heightened by the failure of the blank shot.
General Groves was lying on the ground in the prone position, facing away from the blast. What he said was going through his mind was, what was he going to do when the timer got to zero and nothing happened?
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Despite the uncertainty and the doubts, the implosion device worked first time. With all the technical difficulty they admit to in making such a device, would you not expect a good few failures before you got it right? Of course, it worked first time because they faked it. As with all subsequent nuclear tests, it was fake.
At 5:30 a.m., July 16, 1945, the world entered the atomic age. With an intense flash, a sudden wave of heat, followed by a tremendous shock wave. The ball of fire extended 40,000 feet. The bomb packed a punch equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT, completely vaporizing the steel tower and heating the desert sand into glass for a radius of 800 yards.
Later in the morning, Fermi and physicist Herbert Anderson donned white surgical scrubs and rode in 2 lead-lined tanks to ground zero. Fermi's tank broke down after only a mile, and he had to walk back.
Is there any reason they didn't want Fermi to see the evidence firsthand?
With a yield 200 times greater than the 100-ton test, the fireball created a crater nearly 1/2 mile across and fused the desert sand into a green glass still containing traces of radioactivity 50 years later.
Radiated dust and debris from the blast, fallout, would fall onto neighboring communities. At a few locations, detectors showed rises in radioactivity, but they dropped quickly.
Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
The explosions were mostly created using large towers of hundreds of tons of TNT. A short time before the Trinity test, they detonated such a tower of 108 tons of TNT. The Trinity test was probably a larger such tower, of 1,018 tons of TNT.
May 1945. The hot New Mexico desert seemed far from the ravages of war in Europe.
The trick relies on encouraging people to believe a big explosion is a massive one. With eyewitnesses, this is achieved through distance. From a distance, it is difficult to know how big an explosion is. Most will accept it as being as big as they are told it is. It was very big after all. The trick also relies on people's propensity to exaggerate when recalling experience. It would have been the biggest explosion any of them had ever seen, and so they are likely to tell anyone who asks that it was big, in fact very big. They are unlikely to play it down and say, well, it wasn't all that big actually. For many of them it would have been the most interesting thing that had ever happened in their lives, and so they would tend to big it up.
In order to accurately calibrate the instrumentation for the test, another test, one using only high explosives, was needed. A dress rehearsal of 100 tons of TNT was planned for. Hundreds of crates of high explosives were stacked on the platform of a 20-foot tower. Tubes of low-level nuclear material were scattered throughout the explosives to simulate the radioactive products of a nuclear blast. Everything was set to a scale to match the expected effects of the nuclear test shot. On May 7th, the high explosive was detonated. The orange fireball was seen 60 miles away.
How big is this explosion? How big you perceive it to be depends very much on how far you think it is away and what you have to compare it to. The myth of the blinding light that supposedly makes nuclear bombs distinct from conventional ones is achieved using floodlighting and possibly mirrors, and possibly through the burning of elements such as magnesium within the explosion itself. It is often illustrated to the public with shots of extreme shadowing, which can easily be created in a studio. Most witnesses will never actually see the supposed blinding light, as they were usually told to close and cover their eyes, and often to turn their backs. Often the illusion was reinforced with protective goggles and clothing. The footage is generally put together using footage of smaller explosions, without anything in shot to provide size comparison, mixed with footage of the sun, sunsets, and clouds filmed using time-lapse photography. There is little or no unedited footage provided to the public. Almost all of the footage has cuts, and often cuts away to shots of observers, or shots illustrating the supposed destructive force, and back again to the footage of the developing aftermath of the explosion, and then away again and back again. And so, the public rarely sees a so-called nuclear explosion complete in one continuous sequence. Mushroom clouds are not unique to so-called nuclear explosions. The illusion of nuclear weapons was also manufactured with the use of very large conventional bombs, fuel-air bombs or thermobaric or vacuum bombs. Up close and from a distance, they could easily be mistaken for mythical, much larger so-called nuclear bombs.
But it was one unique conventional bomb that was the climax of high explosives in Vietnam. Called Big Blue 82, it was a blockbuster that caused injuries for miles. At 15,000 pounds, a single bomb was the entire cargo for the journey into hostile airspace. Delivered from the hold of a C-130 cargo plane, the bomb was slowed by a parachute and drifted to its target. When it exploded, the crater was enormous and the destruction total.
You're about to witness the mother of all bombs. The massive Ordnance Air Blast Bomb, or MOAB, 10 tons of H6 explosive.
When they were testing it, people actually thought they were testing small-scale nuclear devices.
Plus, the psychological effect of the nuclear-style mushroom cloud is undeniable.
Good job.
Russian military has announced the testing of a vacuum explosive device that unleashes a shockwave with the power of a nuclear weapon, according to Russian scientists. U.S. forces have used a thermobaric bomb, which works on similar principles, in their campaign against al-Qaeda and Taliban forces.
The first and most obvious question people ask when confronted with the idea that nuclear weapons may be a hoax is, what about Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
While the scientists at Trinity site waited for the test in the New Mexico desert, the primary components of the gun-type uranium weapon were being hoisted aboard the cruiser Indianapolis. The ship set sail for the Pacific island of Tinian in the Marianas. A few weeks later, on August 6, 1945, a B-29 named Enola Gay took off in the early morning hours. Just after 8 a.m., it dropped the weapon named Little Boy, which exploded approximately 1,000 feet over the Japanese city of Hiroshima.
Boom!
The uranium gun weapon, or Little Boy bomb, was a simple design, and scientists were confident it would work without testing.
Designers considered a test prior to combat use unnecessary and impossible, since there was only enough U-235 for one bomb.
And so Little Boy goes into combat as an untested weapon.
In the past 24 hours, 4 heavily loaded B-29s have crashed on takeoff. Parsons' greatest nightmare is the catastrophic consequences of a similar crash, this time with a fully armed atomic bomb on board. Disregarding months of planning, he makes a last-minute decision to attempt the arming of the bomb in the air and not on the ground, something which has never been tried outside the controlled, sterile environment of the laboratory. Armed with just a screwdriver and a spanner, he spends hour after hour practicing the techniques required to arm the bomb in flight. The temperature inside the bomb bay soars to over 40 degrees, but he continues, even as his hands start to bleed. There is no room for error. The next time he does this will be for real, 31,000 feet up in the sky, exactly 2 hours away from the target.
This is padding the narrative in order to make the very dull story of dropping a bomb more exciting, and to sculpt it into a triumph against the odds. The footage of the mushroom cloud over Hiroshima appears to be 2 plumes of smoke filmed in such a way as to make it look like one larger plume of smoke.
"8:18. My God, what have we done?"
The damage to Hiroshima and Nagasaki is not consistent with one single blast. The damage is uniform. Wooden structures have been burned away. More substantial buildings remain, with roofs and other flammable parts burned. It is remarkably similar to the damage caused by conventional firebombing. In Hamburg, Darmstadt, Kassel, and most notably Dresden, firebombing was used in such a way as to create an effect known as a firestorm, where a fire attains such intensity that it creates a central column of rising hot air, inducing strong inward winds which supply oxygen to the fire, which significantly increases combustion. The better comparison to make is with Tokyo, where the construction of buildings was more comparable, and conventional firebombing led to a similar death toll, casualty figures, and damage. Japanese cities consisted mostly of wooden dwellings, and burned easily. Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Tokyo were destroyed by fire. This is not in dispute. It is claimed that in Hiroshima and Nagasaki that a singular atom bomb caused these fires. It is likely that Hiroshima and Nagasaki were firebombed in much the same way as Tokyo, and that the story of Little Boy and Fat Man is entirely fictional.
At 8:15 in the morning of August 6, Japanese time, the first atomic bomb hit an enemy target. The bomb was aimed to explode above 0 point, a spot in the city at the junction of the Motoyiso and Ota rivers. The bomb was intentionally set to explode well above the 0 point to dissipate its radioactivity. Here is the pictorial record of the result. At 0 point, directly beneath the explosion, The soldier in the scene is pointing at the spot from which all damage to the surrounding area was measured in terms of distance from the center of the blast. Within a mile of 0 point, the devastation speaks for itself. But in these very ruins, Army cameramen have found and filmed pictorial evidence that tells in twisted steel and stone the effect of death-dealing atomic power. For example, this was the site of the main Japanese military headquarters. There were approximately 20,000 Japanese military personnel stationed here. They are among the missing. A lone concrete smokestack indicates where a bustling factory once stood. Reinforced concrete buildings seem to have withstood the explosion fairly well, the damage varying with their distance from 0 point. Within an area of a mile to a mile and a half, this type of building was the only type to withstand complete demolition and destruction. Here's a building that was actually knocked sidewise, giving you an idea of the force of the blast. The direction of the blast is graphically told by the slant of this parapet, a concrete wall. Etched in the stone base of what was the Russo-Japanese War Memorial are telltale lines, atomic handwriting for all to read. Another signpost of the direction and force of the explosion is blasted in the polished granite base of this statue. The light surface indicates the angle of the blast, 2/10 of a mile from 0 point. Many of the shattered windows pointed like skeleton fingers the direction of the atomic wind of death. On one side, blown in. On the other, blown out, with atomic tornado force. Inside, the flash burns on the chairs give eloquent testimony on the heat of the blast a mile from 0 point, which singed the mohair upholstery like a blowtorch. Hiroshima City Hall, which stood at an angle of 45 degrees to the direction of the explosion, had its doors and windows blown in, but suffered much less damage than buildings squarely in the path of the blast. The windows and doors offer mute evidence of the way the blast swept into the structures. The destructive circle within a mile from 0 point had a few notable exceptions, mainly reinforced concrete. On the edge of the area of greatest damage was a landmark, the Red Cross Hospital, which never ceased functioning, although it sustained damage. Today, it dominates the desert of a debris that was Hiroshima. Another notable exception to the general demolition was the Higaski Railroad Station in East Hiroshima, a mile and a half from the center of the blast. This building, however, suffered extensive damage. The twisted steel beams and concrete wall show the effects of the tremendous concussion. What's left of the Commercial Museum, within 2/10 of a mile of 0 point, also gives indication of the tremendous push of the explosion. The downward force of the blast turned the roof of the Commercial Museum into a reservoir. Amazingly enough, bridges did not suffer too badly at Hiroshima. This steel rail bridge 1 mile from 0 point had the side toward the explosion virtually blasted by flying particles, which removed almost all the paint. But the side away from the explosion did not need a new paint job. Roads in the area fared better than buildings or bridges. Shortly after the fires died down, traffic was resumed. Today, these highways through the ruins are again in use. Beside our military traffic trudge the survivors of vanished Hiroshima, the first city in history to be atom-bombed into oblivion.
It would be easy to ensure the bomber crews responsible for the firebombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki didn't survive the war. And it would be easy to convince people to lie, with bribes and with the idea that it is a noble lie that would bring an end to the war. Where is the big black scorch mark we saw from the bird's eye view of the Trinity site? It's all so much more dramatic when you add dramatic music.
Trinity had been a success, questions remained about Fat Man.
Three days later, another mission carrying the plutonium implosion weapon named Fat Man detonated over Nagasaki.
Cue the dramatic music. Hopefully by now you're beginning to see this for what it is, pure Hollywood.
The uranium gun weapon, or Little Boy Bomb, was detonated over Hiroshima at an altitude of 1,800 feet, the height to achieve maximum blast effect. 3 days later, the Fat Man implosion bomb was detonated over Nagasaki. In Hiroshima, 70,000 people were killed or listed as missing. Of its 90,000 buildings, over 60,000 were demolished. The implosion bomb dropped on Nagasaki took the lives of 42,000 people and injured 40,000 more. It destroyed 39% of all the buildings in the city. With a yield of 20 kilotons, similar to that of Trinity, this weapon will be considered a nominal atomic bomb and provide a blueprint for all future nuclear weapons.
These skulls in the foreground are very illustrative. Throw in a nice emotive baby playing in the rubble. Burn victims are in no way evidence of nuclear detonation. Standard heat will cause burns. Burn victims are indicative of firebombing. Radiation is also not proof of nuclear detonation. Radiation can easily be faked. It merely needs to be claimed. But as we have seen from the TNT test at Los Alamos, radioactive material can be spread by conventional explosives, and so presumably conventional bombs. However, there is no significant evidence of any long-term radiological contamination of either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the American military proceeded to stretch the truth even further than they had before. Next came Operation Crossroads at Bikini Atoll. Crossroads consisted of two tests, the first codenamed Able, the second codenamed Baker. The supposed purpose of Crossroads was to test the effect of nukes on naval hardware, though many say it was a way of getting rid of surplus military ships left over from the war.
The bomb will not start a chain reaction in the water, converting it all to gas and letting all the ships on all the oceans drop down to the bottom. It will not blow out the bottom of the sea and let all the water run down the hole. It will not destroy gravity. I am not an atomic playboy, as one of my critics labeled me, exploding these bombs to satisfy my personal whim.
By dismissing the absurd, you can camouflage the ridiculous as plausible. Able, supposedly dropped from a plane, was likely a large conventional bomb.
The bomb missed its intended target by nearly 800 yards.
Baker, a much bigger explosion, was probably large amounts of submerged explosives. Soon enough the Soviets would begin to build their own fake nuclear bombs. August 29th, 1949. The Soviets faked their first atomic bomb. Making a device that will cause a nuclear explosion is one thing. Making deliverable nuclear bombs is a further challenge. Mass manufacturing these devices so that they can be stockpiled, ready for use as and when needed, brings with it further difficulty. It is not denied that nuclear weapons have a lifespan. This is good for the industry, as the need for periodical replacement generates ongoing revenue.
2 years after Crossroads, authority was given by President Truman to proceed with Operation Sandstone. The 3 devices utilized on Sandstone employed new technology to double the explosive force of the bomb, using the same amount of plutonium spent over Nagasaki. This technology met Department of Defense requirements for more efficient bombs and increased the ability to stockpile nuclear weapons. The results of Sandstone affected the design of future nuclear weapons, rendering the Mark III production components of the Fat Man bomb obsolete. The Mark IV and Mark V designs brought improved performance and lighter weight to nuclear weapons.
The purpose of Sandstone, and later Greenhouse, was to incrementally double and double again the power of these fictional bombs. At first by using the nuclear fuel more efficiently, and then by adding elements, primarily isotopes of hydrogen, deuterium and tritium. This would ultimately lead to the myth of the fusion bomb, many times bigger again. Also, during this period, they would invent a way of utilizing U-238 within the bombs. Before, they had wanted to maintain the idea that making nuclear bombs was very difficult due to the production method of plutonium and the separation method for U-235 being difficult, time-consuming and producing very small quantities with very high production costs. The use of ordinary uranium-238 was required to make it conceivable for them to continue making bigger and bigger bombs requiring more and more fissionable material, and to make a large number of them. It was also very convenient, as large quantities of uranium-238 were left over from the process of isolating uranium-235. Though uranium-235 and/or plutonium would continue to be an essential element of each fictional fission bomb.
A fourth test on Operation Greenhouse was the item test, about a 45.5 kiloton test in which tritium was burned in the very center of the nuclear explosion. And this process of putting tritium at the very center of the nuclear weapon is called boosting. And we kick the yield up from about 20 kilotons to 45.5 kilotons, more than doubling it by that process. Another of the events on Greenhouse was the George event. Now, George is a large 225 kiloton weapon that was used to burn a deuterium capsule. And this is the first of our thermonuclear weapon experiments to ever be conducted.
October 3rd, 1952. The British faked their first atom bomb. It was supposedly detonated inside the hull of a frigate, 8 feet 10 inches below the waterline. It was likely just a frigate filled with large quantities of explosives.
Dr. Penny gives the order for the weapon to be fired at 8 o'clock next morning. One scientist remains to arm the firing circuit. Connect the batteries. 1, 2. Next, the switches. 1, 2, 3. Now the key. Turning the circuit into position to fire. That's it. The weapon is ready to explode at the touch of control headquarters on an island some miles away. But it can't be fired before this man gets there, since he carries a safety link, and without that link the firing circuit is still open. Inside headquarters, the rest of the control party are waiting at their instruments. In the half-light of the control room, the safety link is delivered to the controller. The final process of firing can now be set in train.
Time bracket open. Fox George, this is How 1. Pass your message, over.
Hello, How 1, this is Fox George. Phase pattern completed. Over.
Understand. Phase Saturn completed. Out.
Right. You can put the safety key in now.
Safety link in. Circuit complete.
Can we have the all-ready signals, please? Mr. Abercrombie, please. Thank you. Minus 8.5 minutes.
clear of the mainland, but it's still highly charged with dangerously radioactive water and mud.
Situated on the Zero Island was the cab, or building, which housed the device. The Mike device was known as a wet bomb because it used liquid hydrogen isotopes to create the thermonuclear reaction. This made the device very large, weighing some 62 tons, and impractical to use as a deliverable weapon. A plywood tube ran from the Zero Island across the causeways to a detection station on the farthest island, a distance of nearly 2 miles. This tube was filled with helium, allowing lethal radioactive rays faster travel to the detection station before the island was consumed by the fireball.
A 2-story, 82-ton steel cylinder containing a concentric series of thermos bottles, which housed the super-chilled liquid deuterium, the hydrogen fuel, as well as raw uranium, tritium, Teller's plutonium spark plug, lead baffles, gold leaf reflectors, an ablative polyethylene lining, and, sitting at the very top of the assembly, a Nagasaki-style fission bomb to get it all going. The mechanism, along with its support and refrigeration gear, required a hangar-sized building called a shot cab to house it. The pipes leading off to the right were for observation purposes. They would carry the initial bomb light down a 2-mile wooden tunnel to sensors on a neighboring island. Cruiser Estes ordered the capacitors of the fission primary to simultaneously discharge into 92 detonators. The resulting shock waves raced through the high explosive shell, converging on and compressing the plutonium sphere into a supercritical metallic fluid, and crushing the tiny initiator at its core, releasing a few dozen neutrons to start the chain reaction. Million-degree X-rays outran the blast wave by milliseconds, racing down the radiation channels to immolate the interior plastic lining and send it crashing inward toward the plutonium spark plug suspended within the now superheating liquid deuterium. Pressure from the fissioning spark plug touched off a fusion reaction in the tritium at its core. The expanding shockwave met the inwardly rushing radiation to further compress the deuterium. Hydrogen atoms began to fuse, momentarily creating every element that had ever existed in the universe, and a couple more besides. A few millionths of a second after receiving its orders from the Estes, Mike had burst free of its thermos bottle and was heading for the upper stratosphere.
Fusion bombs were most commonly referred to as hydrogen or H-bombs. This may be because they have nothing to do with fusion of hydrogen into helium, but simply that in order to fake bigger and bigger bombs, the igniting of large quantities of concentrated hydrogen was required, rather than the towers of TNT utilised in the earlier fake fission bomb tests. In 1953, the Soviets faked their first so-called hydrogen bomb.
In the spring of 1953, the Atomic Energy Commission and the Department of Defense conducted 11 nuclear weapon tests in Nevada under the code name Upshot Knothole.
The first of the events, codenamed Encore, was a 27-kiloton nuclear device airdropped and detonated at about 2,800 feet, Grable, and it was delivered by the Army's new artillery cannon. A 280-millimeter projectile was fired and detonated over about the same blast area with a yield of about 15 kilotons at an altitude of about 500 feet.
As well as making their fictional bombs progressively more powerful, they would also push the idea that at the same time these fictional bombs can be progressively shrunk. They have gone as far as convincing the public that they can be fitted into a suitcase, and that you can fit up to 10 of them on the end of an intercontinental ballistic missile.
Castle Bravo, the largest device ever detonated in atmospheric testing by the United States. Bravo was a hydrogen bomb using solid thermonuclear fuel, confirming the designs of Edward Teller and Stan Ulam, and paving the way to producing aircraft-deliverable hydrogen bombs and more effective weapons.
Castle Bravo was supposedly a smaller device than Iron 9, though more powerful, though the building it was housed in was of a similar size.
Significantly exceeding its expected yield by 2.5 times, Castle Bravo, with an explosive power of 15 megatons, stripped the islands clean of vegetation and took the scientists by surprise. The huge explosion released large quantities of radioactive debris into the atmosphere. This incident pushed the dangers of fallout from nuclear weapons clearly into the public mind. Almost 9 years had passed since the cancellation of the deep underwater test on Operation Crossroads. That test was finally conducted as Operation Wigwam.
Despite their initial size, they convinced the public with ease that fictional hydrogen bombs could be reduced in size sufficiently so that they could be dropped from aircraft or delivered by missile.
Operation Red Wing was conducted in the Pacific, primarily to test high-yield thermonuclear devices. Cherokee event would be the first delivery by U.S. aircraft of a thermonuclear weapon. This weapon would detonate with a yield of 3.5 megatons, almost 200 times the power of the Trinity device.
General Bernard A. Schriever is one of the first to suggest the H-bomb should be miniaturized to fit on an intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM.
In the fall of 1957, with test moratoriums looming on the horizon, 24 nuclear tests were conducted in the Nevada desert under the code name Operation Plum Bob. During Plum Bob, the Hood event would become the largest test ever conducted in the atmosphere within the continental United States. Hood, a 74-kiloton device, was suspended 1,500 feet above the desert floor on a balloon. While new weapon designs continue to be tested, the Department of Defense used the series to accelerate military training in nuclear warfare while continuing its study of the effects from nuclear explosions.
Much of the nuclear testing was designed in such a way as to expose as many military personnel to the hoax as possible, so that they would perpetuate the myth by word of mouth, and so that as many people as possible would have an uncle or some other relative who was involved, and so would likely consider nuclear weapons a reality.
The 21st test, conducted during Operation Plum Bob, was the Rainier event. This was the first fully contained underground nuclear weapon detonation conducted by the United States. The 3-kiloton device was detonated 790 feet below Rainier Mesa, vaporizing rock into a molten bubble 100 feet wide. This technology would have great importance after the Limited Test Ban Treaty, which would prohibit all but underground testing of nuclear weapons and hide future experiments from prying eyes.
Underground tests are very easily claimed. For many, no footage is produced at all. Though it can be argued that underground you might better maintain a critical mass, it is likely that all underground tests are just as fake as those above ground.
During Operation Hardtack, the United States detonated 35 nuclear devices, as many as had been fired in all prior Pacific tests. By now, nuclear weapon tests were perceived in large part as saber-rattling, increasing the international tensions that could lead to all-out nuclear war.
They've pretended to drop them from aircraft, shot one out of a cannon, hung them from balloons, exploded them underwater and underground. Why not blast a few into space on rockets?
Teak, with a yield of 3.8 megatons, detonated nearly 50 miles above the surface of the Earth. The detonation created a violent magnetic disturbance in the atmosphere known as EMP, or electromagnetic pulse. This phenomena silenced radio transmissions for nearly 8 hours and damaged electrical circuits from Hawaii to New Zealand. Immediately following shots Teak and Orange in the Pacific, the United States conducted Operation Argus, 3 1-kiloton missile-borne tests in the South Atlantic.
The objective of the Argus experiment was to take a close look at the phenomena associated with the trapping in the Earth's magnetic field of relativistic electrons produced by nuclear detonations at very high altitudes. It was necessary to learn the governing parameters of these phenomena so we could make reliable estimates of their military importance. There seemed to be a good possibility that they were very important, and for that reason, there was a pressure on this entire operation to secure quick results.
A fleet consisting of 9 ships headed out for the South Atlantic. It is here that the Earth's magnetic field dips to its lowest point in what is known as the South Atlantic Anomaly. 3 X-17A missiles are launched from the deck of the USS Norton Sound. The missile's 1-kiloton warhead detonates at an altitude of 300 miles. As Christophilus had predicted, charged particles from the detonation travel along the lines of the Earth's magnetic field, temporarily creating a new belt of high-intensity radiation. For one of the most significant findings of Argus is that the detonation of a nuclear device in the ionosphere could create selective blackouts of radio communications.
Cactus event. This is a little 18-kiloton device that produced a crater about 137 feet across and 37 feet deep. Many years later, 1980, all of the fission debris and radioactive material on Inuitak Atoll was gathered up and dumped into the cactus crater, and then a concrete dome was placed over the crater to keep and to stabilize the radioactive material that had been contained in it.
They swept all the radioactive material under a dome-shaped concrete carpet.
By November of 1958, the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union begin test ban negotiations in Geneva. With the exception of 3 French tests in the Sahara, the world is spared the rumble of atomic blasts for the next 34 months.
At
At Regan, deep in the Sahara, France goes forward with the detonation of her first atomic bomb, defying a United Nations resolution, the heated protests of Japan and most of Africa's newly independent nations, and the disapproval of both America and the Soviet. Since the autumn of 1958, Britain, the United States, and Russia have voluntarily suspended nuclear tests, and for 15 months have been trying to reach agreement on a formula to ban all atomic weapons development. Now, France presses forward with this first in a series of firings to force her way into the exclusive nuclear club. This first blast is on a level with bombs exploded over Hiroshima and Nagasaki in World War II. The 250th nuclear weapon explosion in history carries France a step further towards General de Gaulle's dream of national glory restored.
Within 2 years, a dozen Atlas D missiles are deployed and operational. The first hardened squadron of Atlas launchers are turned over to the Strategic Air Command in August 1960. The missiles are deployed within blast-protected structures called coffin launchers. Even greater protection is afforded by the silo launcher. The new Titan ICBM is designed for silo launching. The Titan I is heavier, sturdier, and has greater lift capacity than the Atlas. While the early models of the Titan I are armed with a 3.8 megaton warhead, the Titan II would become the largest ICBM the United States would ever deploy. By the end of 1961, Atlas squadrons expand to a total of 57 operational missiles. Uncertainty over the potential glut of Soviet ICBMs presses upon military planners. The R-9 and R-16 are competing designs for the Soviet response to the Titan I, each with a range of 6,000 miles. An inherent deficiency, shared by both the U.S. and Soviet ICBMs, is their use of non-storable liquid fuel. Liquid fuel missiles require hazardous and time-consuming fueling procedures prior to launch. The greatest disadvantage of these missiles is response time. With the early warning for ICBMs coming over the pole at 15 minutes, rapid response is critical. Solid fuel missiles, however, can be launched on command. Advances in solid fuel propulsion lead to the contract for the Minuteman, the world's first solid fuel ICBM. Holding a temporary advantage in numbers of strategic missiles, the United States has reason to remain vigilant when it comes to Soviet nuclear weapons expertise. For 2 years, an uneasy moratorium on weapon testing continued between the United States and the Soviet Union. Secretly, the Soviets began designing new weapons of mass destruction, including a 57-megaton hydrogen bomb, the largest nuclear weapon ever built. This monster bomb was a scaled-down version of a 100-megaton design and was aircraft deliverable.
Russians had shattered the voluntary moratorium. The United States would soon follow suit with an extensive series of weapon tests for massive retaliation.
Concern arises that the U.S. is falling behind in nuclear weapons development. The next month, the Soviets conduct several high-altitude tests. The results permit them to develop data similar to that of the Teak and Argus series.
Tensions mounted as nearly 100 nuclear tests were conducted between the Nevada test site and the Pacific Ocean under the code names Nugget, Storax, and Dominic. Operations resumed at Johnston Island and Christmas Island during Operation Dominic. The United States negotiated the use of Christmas Island from the British, who had used the island to conduct their own thermonuclear tests. Multi-megaton nuclear weapons were loaded aboard B-52 strategic bomber aircraft, delivered from Hawaii, and airdropped off the south end of Christmas Island.
Then when we were allowed to come back and test in the Operation Dominic, the Fishbowl series, and Fishbowl was reserved for the high altitude tests, and we did 6 more. Most of the experiments were related to communications degradation, high altitude EMP, and radar blackout, and radar jitter, radar scattering.
Starfish Prime, the first test in the Fishbowl series, lifts off from Johnston Island atop a Thor missile. Reaching an altitude over 5 times higher than Teak in 1958, the Starfish Fireball enters the Van Allen belt, igniting a violent auroral display. The bomb's electromagnetic pulse effect is pronounced in Hawaii, causing blown fuses and radar blackouts throughout the Hawaiian Islands. A shower of highly charged radiation spreads rapidly into the regions of near space frequently traveled by Earth's artificial satellites.
This government has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
October 25th. Amidst escalating world tensions, Bluegill Triple Prime is successfully launched and detonated. On the 28th, at the height of the crisis, the Soviets conduct a high-altitude nuclear test requiring the launching of 3 ballistic missiles. November 1st, White House struggles to verify that Soviet missiles in Cuba have in fact been disabled. Despite this destabilizing factor, both the U.S. and the Soviets conduct high-altitude nuclear tests on the same day.
4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
The high-altitude nuclear tests appear just as fake as those faked at lower altitudes. Some appear to be achieved by dropping packets of powder onto a hard surface that explode on impact.
Following Tightrope, the final atmospheric test by the United States, negotiations begin for the Test Ban Treaty of 1963.
In 1963, we entered the limited Test Ban Treaty that prohibits any atmospheric testing.
Prohibitions of nuclear testing, moratoriums, talks and treaties, reinforce the supposed threat and allows the power structure to pose as rational peacemakers, and allows for the demonization of those who supposedly don't adhere, and also helps prevent lesser countries from faking their own nuclear weapons. Negotiations may also provide an opportunity for nations to cooperate on how the nuclear hoax is implemented in an incremental, escalating, apparently tit-for-tat manner. For the USSR and the United States, there ceased to be any need for continuing to fake nuclear tests once the nuclear myth had been well established. However, they would both continue to fake nuclear tests and to expand their fictional nuclear arsenals in a contrived game of one-upmanship. Periodical bilateral talks would help to convince the world that each side was continuing to arm itself ever more and provide a plausible explanation for why it never led to nuclear war.
The potential for a functioning Soviet ABM poses new challenges to ICBM warhead design. The outcome of this research is the cluster warhead.
Whilst the arguments over ABMs continued, American scientists were preparing a countermeasure: multiple, independently targeted re-entry vehicles, MIRVs for short. One single missile could now carry 10 separate warheads, each capable of destroying a city.
Once you got into the MIRV era, the problem of strategic defense became infinitely more complicated, infinitely more expensive, because you had to devise ways of going after a multiplicity of warheads and all kinds of junk.
Over the next 10 years, the Soviet ICBM force would grow to near 1,500 fictional nuclear-tipped missiles. By comparison, the US force rose to over 1,000 ICBMs, with over twice as many fictional warheads.
On October 1st, 1975, the Minuteman ICBM force was briefly shielded from a Soviet first strike by a missile defense known as Safeguard. Developed at a cost of over $20 billion, Safeguard was the United States' only deployment of an ABM system. Convinced that Safeguard's radar could be blinded in a nuclear attack, Congress votes to deactivate the site the very next day.
Money well spent. Beyond projecting power, profit is the primary driving force behind the nuclear weapons myth. It has acted as a protection racket, fleecing taxpayers for protection against a threat that does not exist, providing the industrial military complex with never-ending blank checks for improvement and replacement and for decommissioning of an entirely fake deterrent.
By 1969, the superpowers were, between them, spending more than $50 million a day on nuclear armaments. They agreed to meet in Helsinki to try to halt the arms race. The negotiations came to be known as SALT.
The SALT stands for Strategic Arms Limitations Talks.
Negotiations dragged on throughout 1970 and 1971. In May 1972, after almost 3 years of negotiations, President Nixon arrived in Moscow to sign the SALT agreements with Premier Brezhnev. ABMs had now been discredited, and the two sides agreed to limit them. But all they could agree on offensive weapons was a temporary freeze on missile launchers. Their failure to control MIRVs meant that in the next decade, Russia and America would add 12,000 nuclear warheads to their arsenals.
Through this film we have seen some very poor, clearly fake footage of so-called nuclear weapons. However, America and Russia are not the worst culprits. Their fake nuclear weapons are relatively convincing in comparison to that of the Chinese. However, the prize for the most laudable footage goes to the British.
All the tests were airbursts. This meant that the bombs were exploded at 8,000 feet. At that height, there was thought to be little or no danger of contamination with radioactive fallout.
I think we had to turn our collars up. We were told to cover our eyes.
Minus 40 seconds. Close eyes. Close eyes.
We were to put our heads down on our chest, cover our eyes with our hands. Some of us even used the berries and caps to cover them.
Minus 30.
On the loudspeakers we heard the run up to the drop. The controller then did a countdown.
7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2.
And then at 0 we felt this almighty heat. Like somebody passing a 5-bar electric fire very close to your back and then moving it away. It was so unexpected and so eerie in a way because there's no sound whatsoever. There's just this brilliant flash. Although you have sunglasses on and your hands covering your eyes, you could see all the bones in your hands. That bright, showing through. We didn't wait for the order to be given to turn round. We just turned round and we saw this fantastic orange-black flame mass just rising in the sky, and it was enormous. It was pure inferno. We'd seen others, but this was the biggest we'd seen. It was almost beautiful. In fact, I think it would be described as being beautiful. And it rose very rapidly in the air. We were about 20 miles away, I think, and we got a really magnificent view of this thing. Unfortunately, the gurus forgot to admit or tell us about the blast. think one was aware of a steadily enlarging ripple in the sky. This must have been something to do with the blast, but of course it didn't ever occur to us that this is what it was until afterwards. We were stood there gazing at this cloud, and then all of a sudden there was the loudest bang you have ever heard. And then there was a sort of stunned silence. Gosh, that was loud type of thing.
This time, everything had worked to plan. In the primary stage, lasting 70 millionths of a second, the atomic trigger had exploded. A huge flux of X-rays then poured out, causing the secondary reaction, the fusion of hydrogen, and the release of vast amounts of energy. Within a second, the bomb had erupted into the morning sky as a fireball more than a mile across. At last, this was the successful H-bomb test that the government had craved.
On the 18th of May 1974, the Indians faked their first nuclear bomb. It was an underground test and could easily be achieved using large amounts of regular explosives. They claim to have conducted 5 more tests in 1998, 3 on the 11th of May, followed by another 2 days later on the 13th.
Only 17 days later, the Chari Mountains of Balochistan saw the predictable but tragic sequel to India's tests. As Pakistan set off its own nuclear devices, the mountain shook and turned white from the blast.
Inevitably, the public would begin to wonder why there never has been a nuclear war, and no cities destroyed by nuclear explosion as an act of terrorism, or as is more likely, a self-inflicted false flag attack.
Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev signed a far-reaching agreement. For the first time, an entire category of nuclear weapons was to be abolished. In front of the world's cameras, the Americans destroyed their cruise and Pershing missiles. The Soviets dismantled their SS-20s. In another milestone in reducing Cold War tension, inspection teams from both sides supervised the destruction.
December 1991, the Soviet Union came to an end. And in that year, the so-called Cold War between Moscow and Washington that began at the end of World War II underwent a historic transformation with the START Treaty. For the first time in history, the two superpowers agreed that year to significantly reduce nuclear weapons that could reach each other's soil. START, or the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, was signed on July 31st, 1991. Under its terms, both nations agreed to each have no more than 6,000 deployed nuclear warheads and only 1,600 delivery vehicles.
Just as easily as they manufactured the hoax, they will dismantle it again. The Americans and the Russians have both in their START treaty agreed to destroy 1/3 of their fictional nuclear arsenals. Will they one day proclaim themselves as heroes for ridding the planet of this mythical technological terror of their own creation? Will they replace the nuke myth with space-based weapons, and like gods control the world with extreme weather and earthquakes, or at least pretend to? Or will one day the population of the world shed the illusion of fear which until now has controlled them?
I'm Galen Winsor, and I thought I'd share a few hands-on practical things that have to do with this nuclear scare scam. Now, you've heard that gamma energy, the kind of energy that comes off a rock like this, is the most penetrating, most damaging of all radiation. And not only that, here is uranium, the parent of radon, and they say if you can detect radon in a home, then it's bad. If you exceed the EPA's limit, it's reason to run you out of your home. Spend $13,000 like they did with Stanley Watrous' house in Pennsylvania the other day to get rid of the radon, to ventilate it out through. Ridiculous. Let's take them one at a time. This is a rock that I picked up in Natarita, Colorado. 16 weight % uranium. High-grade uranium. Hot. I read a thing the other day that says they had high-grade uranium, and lo and behold, it's too hot to transport, so they had to bury it on site. Oh, wonderful. Let's talk a little bit about radiation. If we can, yeah, are we picking up? If you put the probe right there, the meter goes off scale, and you can hear it, all right? Hot. Radiation, gamma radiation, is the most penetrating of all radiation. Oh, is it? All it's got between the rock and the probe is my hand. Doesn't count so pretty much, does it? What if I put the rock behind me? You don't suppose they've been lying to you, do you? I suspect they have. Well, let's do a little bit more. I got a black bottle. Good stuff comes in white bottle. A bottle of no-dose. You can send children down to the drugstore to buy no-dose. All they need is money. In this are 660 white caffeine pellets. In this one is uranium oxide, U3O8. You can't buy it for love nor money. The state of Washington sent 2 of their Gestapo agents over to my home to confiscate my uranium samples on the 17th of December last year. Got a challenge. I'd like to have somebody in the room volunteer to take all of this bottle or all of this bottle. The only thing that I'll tell you is that one of them won't hurt you and the other one will kill you. Do you want the white stuff or the black stuff? White stuff? You do. There's enough in there to kill 4 men your size. The government says we got to ban this material. It's radioactive. Let's check it in the bottom of the bottle. Not very radioactive. Let's take the cap off. Oh goodness, very radioactive. This instrument will only count gamma, energy. It's just energy. Light's coming from those lights, only you're getting lots of infrared from the lights as well as ultraviolet. Energy response, and it's very carefully damped to only discriminated so it only gets the energy that comes from this. I don't want it to respond to a light, just to this. Cost me $1,000 to get an instrument that will just respond to this and not to that. This is radioactive by any definition. Radioactive material giving off radiation that is read by an instrument like this. The daughter of this, radon, cannot be read on this instrument because it gives off alpha particles. An alpha particle is a dye-positive particle that comes from the nucleus. It has 2 protons and 2 neutrons, therefore an atomic weight of 4, and it's minus 2 electrons. And if you grab it with a high ionization potential counter, it'll count. But if it travels 2 inches in air or through a piece of paper, it picks up 2 electrons, 2 beta particles, if you will, and becomes helium gas, and it won't count on an ionization chamber. Did you know that this thing right here is giving off helium gas? Alpha comes from uranium. Okay, radioactive material. You pour it out in the hand, and that's radioactive contamination. Is it radioactive? Yeah, it is. Very radioactive. Now, decontamination is nothing but scooping it back up and putting it into the bottle. I just now decontaminated my hand. No, I didn't do such a good job. Not good at all. Is it still radioactive? Yeah, that's called residual radioactivity. Now, under the decontamination rules of the government, when you decontaminate somebody like this that's that contaminated, and this is certainly a reportable incident under current DOE regulations, when you decontaminate him, it has to go down a controlled drain so that you don't disperse radioactivity. Do I qualify as a controlled drain? That material that I just ate is not soluble in body fluids. Like it's been this. It was fired originally at 940 degrees C, where it becomes U3O8, known in the industry as HCl insoluble. In other words, it will not dissolve in concentrated hydrochloric acid, hot. Your stomach has 10th normal hydrochloric acid in it, so it won't even dissolve. The stuff is so fine that it has no texture to it. Doesn't even feel rough. So it's tasteless, odorless, has no texture. How is it supposed to hurt me? Because I've been eating this on lecture tour for 2 years, the state of Washington felt it necessary to confiscate my uranium samples so that I would be safe. Dr. Fulton from the Hanford Environmental Health Foundation called up and he says, "Hey, I heard one of your guys OD'd on uranium today, Galen." And we talked for a little while and he says, "Oh, that was you." And I says, "Listen, I can eat all that stuff I want." He says, "It'll ruin your kidneys." "How are your kidneys?" "They're fine." "Well, you should have been chelated within 4 hours. And I mean, you guys are going to follow me around the country and give me chelating agents every 4 hours after I eat it on lecture tour?" He says, "We'll give you any medical assistance that you need, Galen. We don't want anything to happen to you." I said, "Did that include turning out the federal SWAT team 4 days ago to get me?" Where are these guys coming from? Well, here's a piece of metal. Density of 19, 19.0. If you know your chemistry and physics, you know that there are only two metals that have that density: plutonium and uranium. Radioactive, pyrophoric, density of 19. Outside of a laboratory, most of you can't tell me whether this is uranium, plutonium, or a mixture of the two. Now, I said that it's heavy, and it is. Let's see if it's radioactive. Yeah, it is. Pyrophoric, what does that mean? Pyro, fire. Black on the end. The spark that just came off there is pyro, fire, burn. If it's plutonium, I just contaminated this area of Arizona in excess of the EPA's limit for 1 square mile of surface. Somebody laughed. It's serious. The end of progress altogether says that I just contaminated you in excess of the limit for 1 square mile. It's now silver on the end. Tomorrow it'll be black because it self-oxidizes, this black color like this, all by itself. Plutonium does that and uranium does that. Is it hazardous? Yeah, it is, because they take depleted uranium metal and make it into 50 caliber bullets, fire them from shoulder-held weapons. In 1976, they obsoleted tank warfare with these things because it only takes one dog face with one weapon to knock out a 65-ton tank. It'll go through 3 inches of armor plate, and when it comes out the other side, it's that white hot spark that we just made. And the 5 men in that tank are dead because it'll burn all of the oxygen out of the air and burn their flesh. 1976, they obsoleted tank warfare, and you never even knew that. They make 10,000 of those bullets every day in the United States. We got enough in arsenal to sink all of Russia's tanks, and our boys in the Defense Department don't even talk about it. Yeah, it's hazardous to your health. Reminds me, lead is hazardous to your health too, isn't it? Particularly if it's in a 45 slug like this and it hits you right here going about 2,600 feet per second. It's not the material, it's the impact from the velocity. Let's be very specific in the words that we use. This particular chunk of lead came out of a human body. My son, who's a deputy sheriff, thought maybe I could use it on tour. That's called dying of lead poisoning. Anything less is a figment of the imagination because it's not soluble in body fluid either. This is a pellet of cobalt-59. If you put it in a reactor into a neutron field, you can convert cobalt-59 to cobalt-60, which gives off a gamma. It becomes the source that doctors use to irradiate patients to 7,000 Roentgen for one patient. The total dose absorbed by radiation workers at 3 Mile Island in the last 6 years is something like 1,500 Roentgen. 5 times more given to a single individual in a doctor's facility. Now, do you know why I say that the federal regulations are absurd? And if you live by those federal regulations, maybe you're being absurd too? This same material that's labeled high-level waste by our current government, our current Congress. Now, plutonium is an interesting chemical element. It is created in a nuclear reactor. The Manhattan Project built 8 of these reactors at Hanford. The first one took 12 months from sagebrush to nuclear steam to build, and it had never been done in that size before. How could they do that? Why did they do it? To create this element called plutonium. Plutonium has been assessed as being the most hazardous material on Earth. Now, from the standpoint that you can make an atomic weapon out of it, yes, it is quite hazardous, because a piece of it that big, 2.5 kilograms, that's only 5 pounds, is the force that delivered 20,000 tons of TNT equivalent over Nagasaki. Indeed, it is hazardous. The one over Hiroshima that had fully enriched U-235 in it was 5 times as big. So plutonium is more dangerous than U-235, is it not? By a factor of 5. It takes 5 times as much U-235 as it does plutonium. Therefore, it is the most hazardous thing. Enter the great pretenders. They said that 5 grams of plutonium, properly distributed over the face of the Earth, would kill everybody on Earth. Now, if you can only get one 20 kiloton weapon to go on 2,500 grams, how's 5 grams going to kill everybody on Earth? Early on, I had a fear that said, if there is this much fissile material, that can undergo a chain reaction, we called it in the beginning, then if you set a match to it, all the fissile material in the world is just going to keep right on going. Totally unfounded fear. It turns out that when you're in this business of recovering plutonium, like we recovered so much of it at Hanford, we found out that if you have it in a solution where it's less than 5% plutonium, it won't go critical any way that you kick it. And when you get it to 100% plutonium, you better be careful. Because if you put it in more than a 5-inch diameter cylinder, you're playing with fire. You can undergo what is known as an uncontrolled criticality, accidental criticality. The air turns blue. If the cylinder is sealed, it will explode from steam pressure. And that steam pressure builds up in a millisecond, which is about that long. No, you don't horse with it. And then you find out that those 8-foot thick shielding walls on those canyons were put there because they didn't know how much was a critical mass. They says, if we make a mistake, we don't want to die, so we will provide the shielding. And so this shielding thing started for no other reason than they didn't know what was a critical mass. Well, through the years, we got pretty good at telling what a critical mass was. And I have worked in a plant where I had half a critical mass in this hand, barehanded, dressed in street clothes, half in this hand, wearing a lab coat, and I'd put this half in a pocket on this side and this half in a pocket on this side and walk down the hall. If those two ever got together, there would be a blue flash. They never got together because I was in between them. And we do that every day. And each half had to meet definite dimension characteristics. And so we'd take them down and pass them one half at a time, and they'd measure it and say, yeah, that one will pass. And then we'd pass them the other half, and that one will pass too. But they were carefully put in separate bird cages so they couldn't get together accidentally. Well, those of us who worked with it enjoyed it. We knew what we were doing. We worked at it. When the President of the United States decided not to operate that fuel reprocessing plant, I started scrambling to find out what was going on. Many things had been done in the name of health and safety. Don't get burned. You got to have a safety record. You have to be safer than anybody else. We were already safer than anybody in the whole world. Well, you can't afford to get burned with this. You've got to enforce the limits. You've got to keep it. And I says, hey, that's not what the ball game is at all. I'll bet you the ball game is something else. And in 1982, when the Congress passed the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982, a guy by the name of Mo Udall, I don't know whether you people in Arizona have ever heard of him or not, authored that bill. It's called the High-Level Waste Disposal Act of 1982. The material he called waste is the reusable uranium fuel that I had been working on for 32 years. Needless to say, Mo Udall and I do not agree on whether that material is waste or not. The name of the game then is who owns the plutonium and how much is it worth? The government says bury it 3,000 feet deep in basalt, and we'll hold a contest among the states to see who gets to bury it. Oh? Why do you want to bury it? Did you ask the owners? Who is the owner of the plutonium? May I submit that it's most likely the nuclear power ratepayer. He is paid for the mining, the fabrication of the parent uranium, power generation, and is being charged in advance for its burial. If you're paying for it, to whom does it belong? How much is it worth? in inflated dollars, a ton of reusable uranium fuel contains useful metal isotopes worth upwards of $10 million a ton. Mo Udall says it's high-level waste. The value of reusable uranium fuel scheduled for permanent disposal probably exceeds the national debt. Naturally occurring plutonium quantities, and you know plutonium does occur naturally. Plutonium-244 is found at the residual activities of the several, 8 at least, Oklo phenomenon reactors across the world. First one found at Gabon, Africa. Naturally occurring plutonium quantities have been enhanced by transmutation of uranium. That's the reason we built reactors in the first place. Our ability to detect and measure emissions from these elements is useful in inventory control. When fissile elements, fissile isotopes, are present at less than 5 weight percent, plutonium-239 equivalent, and the heavy metal oxide matrix is stored dry in air, it has no critical mass. Remember we talked about shielding was because they didn't know what a critical mass was? If it is light water reactor fuel at less than 5% equivalent fissile content, you can handle it, you can do anything you want with it, you can stack it up, you can have a room full, you can have a handful. As long as you keep it dry, it will not sustain a chain reaction. What then is all this falderall about a little bit, 5 grams will kill everybody in the world? They don't know what they're talking about. And when they say that, they're thumbing their nose at measurement experts like Galen Winsor. I am insulted when they say those things and get away with it because it has no bearing on the truth. It cannot be mishandled. It will not expose any person to an unshielded nuclear reaction. In other words, no controls are necessary except to prevent the pilferage of the inventory. Have you got that one? Let it register. Do you need governmental rules and regulations and instructions? No way. Then why do we have all of those rules? Inventory control practices capitalized on the fear of undereducated masses who work in the industry. I didn't say anything about ordinary people now. I'm talking about the people who have worked in the industry and those who cast stones from without. The Ralph Naders, the Jane Fondas. Now, it doesn't take you much thinking to find out that maybe the industry is the source of the problem. The industry is the one that made up the committees that made the rules that the Congress enforced. You ever thought of it that way? The strangest kind of feather bedding that's ever been dreamed up, it makes the railroad engineers look like pikers. The only amounts of fissile process materials that are of health concern to the handlers are those that can accidentally cause an unshielded nuclear chain reaction, or that will cause erythema from the shortest wavelength, highest frequency, and therefore the most easily shielded ultraviolet light emissions of the electromagnetic spectrum. Big words. Let's see what they mean. The emissions from uranium, plutonium, cesium, all of those things are only important if you assemble an amount that if you get this amount and this amount together, it can go critical. You can get a blue flash and therefore get burned. And that's happened 34 times in the business, and 8 men have died as a result of that. Accidental criticality. Documented in Los Alamos document 3611, if you want to check the source. Or if you've got enough of it together that it's giving off ultraviolet light of this particular wavelength and frequency without any intervening shielding, enough to burn you, sunburn you, erythema, reddening of the skin. If it's less than that, if the effect is less than that, then what is the problem? Excessive government regulation. That's what's the problem. Why then are we still playing this game that any amount of this material is of hazard? Reusable uranium fuel, which has been isotopically enhanced in power-producing reactors, is a valuable national resource, not a high-level waste. The utility operators recognize the future worth of this commodity. Mo Udall, in that Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982, imposed a tribute of $1 per kilowatt hour, $1 per megawatt hour on all electricity produced in a nuclear plant so that they can research and develop methods to throw it away. Why do the utilities willingly pay this amount to the Secretary of Energy? To limit their liability exposure. Who pays that amount anyway? The consumer of nuclear generated power. You have no choice, and therefore I call it a tribute. At the same time, they have provided their own storage basins at these reactors at ratepayers' expense to retain ownership control of the plutonium resource. So you consumer, you ratepayer, you taxpayer are paying for the storage of this fuel, and WNP2 at Hanford has storage that will take them through the turn of the century, and yet every day they are paying a tribute to the Secretary of Energy with the concurrence of the United States Congress and signed by the President of the United States in 1982, 83. Who was that? Ronald Reagan. They have provided those storage basins at ratepayer expense to retain ownership control of the plutonium resource. I started playing a game one day, 7 years ago. I says, okay, Portland General Electric, you've got the Trojan reactor, you've got a storage basin problem, I'm going to make you an offer. I made them an offer that says, I will take all of your spent fuel, FOB your basin, if you will give it to me. In other words, I will take it off your hands at no expense to you. I will ship it, I will store it, I will do everything that needs to be done to that fuel. And you know what they told me? Can I quote them? Go to hell, Galen Winsor. We value it more valuable than platinum or gold. We're going to play the plutonium futures ourselves. Now, where did I learn that the name of the game is who owns the plutonium and how much is it worth? The first plutonium I saw was in a glass tube on the newsreel when I got back from the Pacific in 1946. And that they had in a glass test tube, they said, was worth $500,000. Certainly they had less than 5 grams of plutonium in that tube. That's pretty expensive stuff. And so for the show, they put a pot underneath it in case they dropped it. They said, we don't want to have to pick it up out of the rug. when it was decided for us not to operate this plant, plutonium was guaranteed on buyback by the federal government at $43 a gram. That's quite a price drop, don't you think? When that price guarantee went away in October of 1971, the price of plutonium became $10 a gram. It steadily went down to where its present worth on the market is a minus $2 a gram per year. That's what it costs you to hold on to a plutonium inventory on a material that has been declared worthless by the utility owners and rubber stamped by the Congress of the United States, and they're spending billions of dollars digging holes in ordinary rock so that they can throw it away, dispose of it. Okay, what are you going to do with it? Reusable uranium fuel may be properly stored in air-cooled, dry storage in a cost-effective manner. Nukem in Germany offers this immediate and long-term option as a necessary and safe step prior to reprocessing. They're doing it in Europe. At least 4 regionally located facilities are available in the United States where this concept can be used right now. Barnwell Nuclear Fuel Plant in South Carolina, Midwest Fuel Recovery Plant in Morris, Illinois, this one, Nuclear Fuel Services in upstate New York, and Redox Processing Plant at Hanford, Washington. These fully shielded, already radioactively contaminated storage areas have secure, limited access. All have been operated under processing conditions of 10 CFR 50, and the MFRP has a 10 CFR 70 storage license, the only licensed storage facility away from a reactor in the United States. It singly, all by itself, is capable of storing all of the reusable uranium fuel that needs to be moved away from power reactors for the remainder of this century. We had that storage designed in 1975. Had the approval of the design. Why then are you spending money over here in New Mexico on the waste isolation project? Why are you spending money at Hanford at the basalt waste isolation project? Why are you spending money at Beatty, Nevada for storage when I can already store it in this building that's already built? I just named you 3 others that can do the job all by themselves too, and I know where there's 14 more buildings that can do it. What are we going to do? Redox and other excess facilities at Hanford are capable of dry storing all commercial REF until plutonium recycle, at least through 5% enrichment, is reestablished, or until the 22nd century, whichever comes first. RUF can be cost-effectively stored in existing facilities. Where does Mo Udall came off then, saying that you cannot use this plant for its intended purpose unless it is owned by the United States government. He has said that. The waste isolation projects are politically mandated wasting of national energy and construction resources. Plutonium proliferation by diversion of stored reusable uranium fuel is of minor importance compared to global availability of fully enriched uranium by laser isotopic separation. Let me explain that last thing that I said. Jimmy Carter said you can't ship plutonium to India, but in the same paragraph said you may ship them fully enriched uranium. Oh, Jimmy Carter, that peanut brain, what did he just say? He says that when the Israelis took out the reactor in Iraq, they had fully enriched uranium from France, and they says those rascals, those Iraqis, are going to take that fully enriched uranium, put it in that reactor, irradiate it to plutonium, and therefore have to recover the plutonium in a plant like this, and we stopped them when the fully enriched uranium makes a better weapon than the plutonium in the first place. Now, when the President of the United States says things like that, and when the press gives it credibility, I get insulted. And right after I get insulted, I get angry. And I've been angry for quite a while now. And finally, one day, I said, my own personal security is not important. I think I'll go tell this tale. All I want is to tell my story. The commodity that I communicate is called truth. And so then I ask you a question, a very brief, pointed question. Who owns the plutonium, and how much is it worth? And then I'm going to attach on to that a question I want you to think about till we talk again. If you haven't been burned by this particular source of radiation, what is your problem? You obviously have one. Otherwise, you would join with me in telling the truth about this particular commodity. And so yes, I'm recruiting helpers. What happened to the guys who taught me the business? Thousands of them. The hands-on business. Where are they? They're still there. Why don't they talk? Who are the they that say this is the way the business is going to be run, whether it makes sense or not?
We're back with Galen Winsor, and we're talking about the nuclear scare scam. Galen, it seems to me that from what I've heard you say that the scaring of the people is better than a lock and key to keep this stuff out of the hands of those who might be interested in investigating and keeping this valuable material hidden for just an elite few.
This is probably the way that it works best. And so then the secret was to keep from letting other people know that it could be handled, because first of all, we weren't accepted by the community, and the materials that we were working with, they feared, but there were certain few people that realized its real worth, its potential to be used in ways other than to support our national defense.
Let me ask you a question, Galen. Are you worried about do you have reason to be worried about your personal safety? Because the kind of people that you're describing here are powerful people. I wonder, you're still around, I wonder how much longer we can expect you to be in this game.
Well, on the 13th of December last year, the NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Region 5, turned out a federal SWAT team to get me on a federal warrant issued by Bob Thomas out of Walnut Creek, California. It was kind of funny in a way. They turned out this federal SWAT team at Hanford, and they had my picture, and alongside it says, "This is an irrational individual. He poses a threat to our security. Take him at any cost." Now, the reason that I'm still here only has one logical conclusion. I have lots of help.
Well, you've told us about how that you and others of your friends and colleagues have handled many times this so-called deadly nuclear energy material that the whole world is so scared of. Why weren't you afraid of it?
Because we did silly things like recover some of the undissolved fuel elements out of the redox dissolver that burned a hole in it. And we went in and sampled these things by remote process. We got it out into our hands and found out that we could walk around the lab with them barehanded and they wouldn't hurt us. And we were standing there in the lab tossing them back and forth. Uranium metal that wouldn't dissolve in the boiling nitric acid. Well, if you find out that you can play with it, and it was only 90 days since that thing came out of the reactor, and it doesn't burn you, Why should you be afraid of it?
So in other words, you're telling me that you learned to not be afraid of it because of practical use and application and hands-on experience.
Hands-on. We might even been playing games.
Okay, you say that you swam in this water that was straight from spent fuel used to cool that fuel, and
Yes.
you swam in it.
Yep.
You told me earlier that you went a little bit beyond that. Would you share a little bit of that story?
Well, swimming in it didn't have the desired effect. So I decided I had to be more direct with these people that were giving me trouble. They were kind of hard to teach, so I went to drinking a glass of it a day. I had the bottle of it. Last time I went swimming, why I filled this 2-liter bottle with water and washed it off on the outside in the shower when I washed me off on the outside so that we didn't tattletale. You know, radioactive material is just a trace or a tattletale. So you got to get it off so they won't know that you've been swimming in the pool and drinking the water. So I took this bottle in and set it on my desk. And who would suspect that the manager of safety and analytical service had a bottle of spent fuel pool water sitting on his desk, and he drank a glass of it every day.
And this was unheard of.
Nobody ever did that crazy stunt before.
How has that affected you, Galen?
Well, as near as I can tell, it made me about 6'4" in my cowboy boots, 210 pounds, and really quite a nice fellow.
All right. What then happened as a result of your doing this strange experiment on your desk with this water? What was the result?
Can corporations have a heart attack? I think General Electric had one, because after they ran me through a whole body gamma scan in December of 1974, by the time I got out, because I had a plutonium lung burden and it took 45 minutes to an hour to count that, everybody on site knew that the manager of safety had been swimming and drinking in the swimming pool, the spent fuel storage pool. Had cesium-137 at a ferociously high level. It even exceeded the NRC's limit. And I'd been drinking it. They knew the fat was in the fire. Now, where do we go from here? Well, first of all, I got a poison pen letter from the people in San Jose. And he says, "Thou shalt not do those things. They'll find out that the inventory can be stolen." Well, that didn't sit very well with this cowboy, because nobody tells me what to do, particularly when what I do is right and hasn't harmed me. Who are they to tell me what I want to do? It just didn't sit very well. I was going to do something about that.
What was your motive in this?
Correct information. As an expert in the measuring system, why, it was very obvious that I knew the parameters of inventory control, the disintegration rate of each of these isotopes, how to measure them. That's how we regulated our inventory. And to have these rascals come along and start playing games with the information that I was very expert in, that I had designed the analytical system for this plant around, disturbed me a little bit. No, it made me fighting mad, and I got angry. And I have to admit, in retrospect, that for the next 5, 6 years, I was more than angry. I was hard to live with. Just ask my wife.
Well, in your estimation, then, how dangerous is a nuclear reactor plant?
A nuclear reactor plant is just a way to boil water that's the cleanest, neatest, most economical way to boil water that you've ever seen. And so, in my estimation, nuclear reactors ought to be insured under the same insurance policy as any other steam boiler plant, power generating plant. And to have special consideration under the Price-Anderson Act means that the insurance industry has already paid off the Congress so that they can have a ripoff, charging ever in higher and higher insurance premiums, total coverage much, much greater for a non-existent risk. What a racket.
Can a nuclear plant explode?
Only like any other steam plant. Like Laughlin, Nevada, had a steam explosion. It's a coal-fired plant, but 6 men were killed there last year. That could happen at a nuclear plant, but as far as an atomic explosion, good heavens, no. No way.
What kind of accidents can actually happen at a nuclear reactor generator plant?
You could lose your moderator and the reactor would shut down, the control rods would stick in and you wouldn't be able to start it up. You might do several things that would invalidate some of the safety controls. For instance, an emergency core cooling system. The only reason they put ECCS on a reactor is to destroy it. When you start these big babies up, because they're so big, you only warm them up 50 degrees an hour. And they say, we got an emergency, throw the emergency core cooling system on like they did at 3 Mile Island 2, and you're going to thermally shock that big machine and ruin it so it can never be used again.
Let's talk about 3 Mile Island. What really happened there? We've heard all kinds of stories about meltdown, and they made movies on it that this meltdown could melt right through the earth, clear through to China, and we've seen a lot of scare stories. What really happened at 3 Mile Island? Do you know what really happened there?
Yes, I do. I followed that one very closely. In fact, I know the guys personally who wrote the script for China Syndrome and also wrote the script for the 3 Mile Island fiasco. Dale Breidenbaugh, Dick Hubbard, and Greg Miner, who used to work with me at General Electric, are the MBH associates that wrote that China Syndrome script. And not only that, remember that was the time China Syndrome came out, Jane Fonda starring. 14 months ahead of the TMI-2 accident, it was predicted in writing in New York State that that accident would happen 1 year from the date that that 3 Mile Island 2 reactor started up. It started up in March 1978, and it went down March 28, 1979, right on the day, 1 year anniversary. In other words, with 14 months advance notice, the industry still went along with the sham. Nothing happened there except that the owner, the operator, and the regulators conspired to turn it off.
What melted?
The top of the fuel rods, the third time that the core got uncovered, due to internal pressure, blew the top off some of those rods. They've got Inconel springs in them to keep the pellets, fuel pellets, from vibrating when it's running. Those things are under compression, and when they reduced the outside pressure and the fuel rods were still hot, it blew the top off some of those fuel rods. The fuel rods in TMI-2 are internally pressurized to about 1200 psi with helium gas so that they don't reverse dent when they're hot and running for 5 years. And when they drop the outside pressure, why, that internal pressure with those hot rods blew the side out of some of those rods at the top. But melting, the fuel is already an oxide ceramic. It is a pellet. It's been pressed into a ceramic. When you pick it up and feel it, it feels like metal. It's pressed so very, very tight, hard. And so, no, the fuel didn't melt. The China Syndrome is a scriptwriter's fantasy. Right here, I ought to tell a story, I guess. See, I spent 3 weeks on the island in March of 1981, the 2-year anniversary of this particular, quote, accident. And Tom Hall, who stood alongside Enrico Fermi when they pulled the control rods on 100B in October 1944 at Hanford, and I were delegated to go to the island and find out what happened, and so we did. We went over all of the records and everything else, and near as we could tell from performance records, 51 thermocouples, for instance, only one of which went over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The center line temperature of those rods when they're running is 4,032 degrees Fahrenheit. And so they say things like over 50% of the core was greater than 4,000 degrees. Yes, it was. If it wasn't running at 100% power. So they take that kind of information and bugger it all up so that you don't understand what's going on. They give you a little bit of it. Well, the worst joke that people could dream up, and they says, do you know what the NRC's worst nightmare is? No, I don't know what that is. Galen Winsor and Tom Hall in the TMI-2 control room for an hour by themselves. You know why people that know laugh? These crazy guys from Hanford would have started that baby up and showed that it would run. We'd have started it up, and they were afraid of us.
So there was no accident at 3 Mile Island?
No, they did it on purpose. Shut it down.
Very interesting. Can nuclear radiation cause mutation in people and animals?
If a cell gets too much radiation, it dies. And so if it is a sperm or an ovocyte, why, they die. They don't reproduce, and there are no mutations. I think the good Lord built that safety factor in.
So you're saying that mutation in future generations is an unfounded fear?
Yes, and the studies of the people at Hiroshima and Nagasaki have borne that out. Those people do not have that. Now, they showed the immediate effects of too much radiation. The women who were pregnant showed, the embryo showed the effects of very similar to rubella, measles. Some deformity, certainly, from that radiation insult. But that's not the kind of mutation that's going to go on to the next generation.
Galen, what and where are these burial sites, and what's in them for this so-called nuclear waste? I've been hearing stories about stainless steel containers buried in concrete under the ocean, boiling for over 2,000 years.
That sounds like a real story. Let me start out by saying there are no nuclear waste, only materials created in a reactor to be recovered and used beneficially. Now, high-level waste is radioactive and self-heating. And so fuel, reusable uranium fuel, fits that definition. But if you disregard its intrinsic worth, why then, yeah, it would fit the definition of high-level waste. But let's say there isn't any high-level waste, only material to be recovered and used beneficially. Then what's the low-level waste fiasco? That's an excuse for a federally mandated, non-inspectable disposal system so that organized crime can get rid of any evidence that they want, and it can never be dug up again.
They're afraid to look in there.
Not afraid. They don't want you to. They've got rules on the transport so that if you have an accident with a low-level radioactive waste shipment, why, you call out all of the state police and you make sure that nobody looks at it, that nobody gets exposed, that there's no spreading of the contaminated material. And it's also that you don't find out whose body's in that drum. The situation got so bad that the smell of human flesh was so great that they made it so that you could ship animal biological waste in refrigerated vans so that it wouldn't stink up before you got it buried.
What is then in these low-level or high-level or whatever containers under the ocean?
Nothing. But if you see, they were one time dropping barrels of radioactive waste off barges in the ocean. Do you know what was in them? Not high-level self-heating radioactive waste. Probably had a few bodies and a few guns and a few knives and a few evidences in them too. If you drop them in the ocean, they are truly disposed of. So you know there's an international trade in that right now? You can't do it in the United States, so they transship it across the ocean to South Africa, and they can bury it offshore.
So
what is in those drums?
Well, that's what you're telling me then, that I needn't worry about boiling drums under the ocean for 2,000 years.
No, no way.
Thank you. I'm glad to know that. Well, one more question, Galen. What do you feel like a good portion of these men in Congress know this already?
I know they do. I went there 4 years ago and sat down with the Senate legal staff and told them my hour-and-a-half-long sad story, and Sam Bollinger, one of the lawyers, stood up and he says, "Galen, if I understand you right, why, you want us to have President Reagan snap his finger and make this thing come up straight." And I says, "Hey, Sam, terrific. Go ahead and do it." He didn't take that challenge. He says, "No, I'll tell you what, Galen. Industry likes it the way that it is." I said, Sam, you really know how to hurt a guy. And he says, well, if we change it, what are we going to do for an encore? Yeah, they're fully aware that this thing goes on as far up as the President of the United States. It's the way that industry wants it. The industry is its own problem then.
So the question is then, what is the industry? What is the real story here? Is this an industry of nuclear energy?
The industry has been ripping it off for years and years. In 1975, we knew that large nuclear reactors were dead, that large is not the way to go. The way to go is small, mass-produced nuclear reactors sitting right in the middle of town, one every 10 blocks producing power. We haven't built a reactor right yet. It's time that we do it. Why haven't we? Because of a federal energy cartel. These guys control the amount of electricity, the availability, and the price. And they say, you do not have a choice. I have a choice. I'm going to take one of those decommissioned nuclear subs up in Puget Sound, refuel it, and generate my own electricity. Save the government $5 million because that's what they want to throw them away. I will use it for my own power plant. Quinn Millian up in Omak, Washington, and I are moving on that, and if one of these days I hook one of them up to Pier 91 in Seattle, don't be surprised.
Well, good luck.
What I'm saying to you is that the federal regulations are absurd. The congressmen that put them into place ought to be fired. They ought to be sent home. The regulators, what do you do with them? Quit paying them. The taxpayer, the electorate, elects those people to go out and do a job. Why do you continue to pay them when they're teaching you baloney? When they're putting in regulations that don't make any sense? Cut it out. Quit paying them, fire them, send them home. The term I grew up with says can them. Is it easy? Apparently not. You haven't got the job done. Majority of the Congress is irresponsible, amoral, atheistic, irresponsible. Let's see, how many more adjectives can I drum up? But that many. Let me tell you. We as the people sent a bunch of rascals out to the energy store with a signed blank check. And we say, hey fellows, if you run out of money, just go build us a good power plant. If you run out of money, come back and we'll give you another signed blank check and guarantee the payment out of the ratepayer's pocket. I found out that it doesn't hurt me. You need to find out that it doesn't hurt me, or you. In fact, the only reason for the existence of these big transcontinent distribution lines would be if they could compete with a small mass-produced reactor sitting in your backyard. Why don't they want you to? Because they are the federal energy cartel. They like to set the price, the total availability, and whether you can hook onto it, and if you don't pay your bill, cut you off. That's called power, domain, and control. And they like that. They do not want you to be energy independent. If you had one of these sitting in every 10-block area in Phoenix, you could tell the rest of the world to go get lost. Oh, there's another use for that heat. You could heat your homes in the wintertime, or you could cool them in the summertime with it. Heating, ventilation, air conditioning, they call it, HVAC. In countries where it freezes, you could run that hot water out and chase the frost away in the spring and in the fall. And they found out that plants grow faster in warm water anyway, so you'd irrigate with it all summer. We got troubles in this country. I'm telling you what the problem is. Doing something about it, responsibility is yours.